let's move on, okay, to the second question, which is how can I progress training load from 1 week to the next? And so this is, again, is taken directly from my courses. One of the principles of periodization is the principle of progression. And I want to call your attention to the red, stick figure on the left here. And I'm just going to ask, again, I'm going to ask the audience. I think I can draw here, right? Can I draw? Yeah, okay. So this is, you can think of each step as a week in training, okay? So this step is week 1, and then this is 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is week 6 up here. So if we imagine week 1 to week 6, now that's, that's a staircase. That's, kind of indicative of a progressive overload from 1 week to the next. The load, the load gets higher. But I want to ask those that are watching, okay, what were to happen if instead of, the load getting higher kind of in these nice incremental steps, what were to happen if I took out all 4 of these and I asked the players to get from, the load that they have in week 1 all the way to the load that they have in week 6? What would happen? Right off the bat, what do you think would happen? Is it possible to do? Here we have in the chat again. Yeah, Zion, players would get injured. I agree with you. Okay, and the reason that players would get injured if you asked them to, to jump, let's say, and we can literally think of that as a jump from week 1 to week 6. I just see another in the chat here. Yeah, they may get burnt out. Yeah, so they'll get burnt out, they'll get sick, or they'll get injured. It's one of those 3, right? In any case, the reason that happens is because there's no progressive overload with that type of model, okay? It's too much too soon. Players aren't prepared for week 6 for that very high load because they've been training at that low load from week 1. So essentially what you want to do is you want to make small, gradual increases in load from 1 week to the next. And that's where that staircase analogy comes in, okay? So again, this might sound like it's common sense. It doesn't, again, I asked you guys and you answered it right away. You picked up, yeah, it's not good to do that. It sounds like common sense, but, I can tell you for sure in Canada that despite the fact that this sounds like common sense, it's not done. Here's a good example. Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. What happens when players transition from the high school level, club, amateur club, to university? And I'll ask again, I'll use the same staircase analogy, okay? Typically, let's just, again, conceptually here, we can say that typically at the high school level, the players are kind of stuck around training load levels 1 or 2. They're training 4 days a week, maybe 5. Typically, the intensity isn't super high all the time. I can tell you from in Canada, a lot of players at the amateur level, club level are not in great shape because they don't train hard enough and they don't train enough. And then what happens when they go to university? Do they get a gradual, progressive increase in overload? Let's say they get a scholarship and they go to a top school in the States. What happens? Is it progressive? I would say no. Based on my experience, they go straight into university training camp pre-season, which is 1 or even 2 training sessions a day. Young 17, 18-year-olds playing against, adults, maybe 2, 3 years older, bigger, stronger, faster. If they're coming from Canada where it's cold, they go to the States where it's hot. They got to train in the heat. They're not used to that either. So this jump that I use this analogy for, like, it sounds like common sense, that we shouldn't do it, but we do it all the time. And then what happens? What do coaches say? If the players are, they get burnt out, they get hurt. This happens quite a lot with freshmen, and right? They can't handle it. And coaches will say, well, you know what? You're not prepared for this level. And my answer to that is, of course they're not prepared. They haven't experienced any progressive overload. So if we can do a better job of physically preparing players for higher levels by progressively overloading them, then when they get to those higher levels, they won't get burnt out. They won't get hurt. And I can tell you that, again, this is a broad generalization, but it's true. Okay, male and female. In the last 20 years, once better planning and knowledge of sports science has come into the game, one of the things that we're seeing is that players have much longer careers. In my day, in the 90s, most top players were retired by the time they were 30 years old. It was very rare. And it was typically either they had sustained too many injuries or they just, they couldn't handle the training anymore. Whereas now you can see lots of players playing into their mid to late 30s and, and even later sometimes, right? And that's one. And here's another thing to think about. And again, it's a bit of a generalization, but a lot of players and coaches and fans and everybody will watch the game now, and they'll say, again, on the male or female side, and they'll say, well, the game looks faster now than it did before. The game has gotten faster. The athletes are faster, and they are. If you can look even at some of the GPS data. They have ways to look at older games, and they can, based on camera systems, they can pick out how fast players are running. So players in the 80s and 90s actually didn't run as fast as they do now. Now, why is that? I see something in the chat here. Symptoms of a player who's burnt out. Okay, so I'm going to speak to that just in a sec, Sharif, but let me finish with this point here first. So, is the game faster? Yes. Are the players in the game today faster than they were 10 or 20 years ago? Yes. But the reason is that the faster players 20 years ago were burnt out and injured and could not sustain the level of training they were asked to do. This is a really fascinating thing. I've had, discussions and debates and even arguments with coaches about this, and it's something I'm quite interested in, which is that faster players, which everybody wants, like coaches, if we had a choice, we would all say, yeah, it's better to have all things being equal, it's better to have a player that can run faster because they can outrun their opponents, they can win the ball more. But those players that are faster, they don't respond the same way to high load of training. Slower players typically have a little bit better endurance and a little bit better recovery, and their muscles don't produce the same amounts of force, so they're less prone to injury. Faster players are more prone to injury. So what's the best explanation we have for why the game is faster now? It's because the faster players now are not getting injured and burnt out, and they're able to realize their speed and their potential much more in the game. So anyway, I think it's an interesting topic. I hope you all liked it. And I'll get to Sharif's question now right before we move on. Okay, signs and symptoms of a player who's burnt out. It could be mental fatigue. So I'll give you a few good ones, okay? And this is a simple one maybe that you can use with your players, or if you are a player, you can use with yourself, okay? If you take your heart rate in the morning, that's the moment you get out of bed. So you're in bed, you sit up in bed, you don't go to the bathroom, you don't go get anything to eat or drink or anything. You just sit up in bed and you take your heart rate. You can find your pulse. Just start with 2 fingers on your Adam's apple there, or the middle of your throat there, and then move them a few inches to the side and just press gently. You can feel your pulse. So you can count the number of beats that you get in 10 seconds, quickly multiply that number by 6 and write it down. That's called your morning heart rate. So take that morning heart rate, or have your players take that morning heart rate every day. And then you can start to notice a pattern. Maybe, a good fit player, they might be only 55 or 60 beats a minute, 1 beat per second, more or less, right? If you're starting to get into that overtraining, that, too much high training load days without enough recovery in between, if you're starting to get into overtraining, then what starts to happen is you start to see a very, very high rise in morning heart rate. So if you're tracking morning heart rate and then all of a sudden you notice this quick jump, then that's a good indication that something is wrong. And again, it's a good question, Sharif, right? Because you said, could it be physical or could it be mental? We don't know necessarily. You will know if it's physical if you go back and check the training load, because it's possible that jump in morning heart rate coincided with the start of preseason, for example, where the average training load for the week was much higher, or with some other period of time, like maybe you're dealing with players that they started playing school basketball at the same time that they're already doing their soccer or whatever. So whatever it is, these are things that happen. And without tracking and monitoring, okay, what I'll say is, without tracking and monitoring these things, you're working in the dark. You're guessing. So I don't like guessing. I'm a scientist. I like to measure things. So what I'll say is, it's very important to track and monitor these things, because if you do, then you can identify. And of course, if a player is starting to look burnt out, if their morning heart rate starts to go up, if their training load is really high, right, relative to what they've been doing before, you can identify it right away and you can stop it before it leads to an injury or something else like that. So again, it's a good topic, fascinating topic. I'll try to move on so we can get to the rest of it. But here's the principle of progression in a nutshell. Okay, you make small incremental increases in volume and or intensity. So you can raise volume, you can add minutes to your training, or you can raise intensity, making the training harder in some way. Here's how you increase volume. Well, it's very easy. You add time to repetitions of exercises. If you're doing interval running, if you're doing small-sided games, you're doing whatever, rather than making them 3 minutes long, you can make them 3.5 or 4 minutes long, whatever it is. Add time. Volume is easy. You can add repetitions. Instead of 4 repetitions of a small-sided game, you add a 5th one. So that's how you increase volume. And then intensity, okay, this is a little trickier, but you can do it as long as you're monitoring and checking. If you're on the field, you can increase or decrease the field size. This is interesting because sometimes when you increase the field size, you actually decrease the intensity because you slow things down. But sometimes when you increase the field size, players end up running more because there's more space to run. So you have to look at, again, this is where the art comes in, right? You have to know your team, your players, the ability. Decreasing field size, again, can have the same effect. Sometimes it minimizes touches and really speeds things up. I was actually just chatting with Anthony right before we started about futsal. Okay, and one of the benefits, I'll tell you, I've spoken at, with Canada Futsal about this. I presented at their conference 5 years ago now. We talked about how, in addition to all the technical benefits of futsal, and that's, the 4v4 game on a small field with a hard floor, right, and a heavier ball, there's also a real significant physical benefit, which is that players are almost never resting. Okay, so they get quite a high training stimulus when they're on the pitch. Then there's substitutes, sometimes they come in and out, but in any case, there's a very good physical benefit to it too. And one of the reasons is that in that 4v4 game, you're almost never able to stand still. It's very rare unless there's a penalty or something when the ball goes out. So in any case, you can increase or decrease field size. You can decrease the time of a rest interval. If you're playing an 8-minute game with 3 minutes of rest in between, you decrease that rest to 2 minutes. Well, all of a sudden you've increased intensity. So you have to, again, be very diligent when you plan these things, but you can do it. And you can add conditions to games. So if we're talking soccer training, right? Maybe you make a condition where you minimize the number of touches. You go to 2 touches. All of a sudden it speeds things up, makes the game more intense. Maybe you make a condition where every player, in order for a goal to count, every player needs to be on this attacking half of the field. All of a sudden that forces people to run forward and they can't stand still at the back or whatever. So there's lots of ways to do it. Remember, it's an art, but these are some suggestions, okay? And if you increase volume or you increase intensity, well, what have you done then? You've increased training load, because that's what training load is. It's the product of volume multiplied by intensity, okay? I said, for examples, there's some videos in this presentation, which I'll share with everybody here at the end, and of course I'll send to Anthony as well. We've got lots of examples of stuff that I teach in my courses, and on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. I'm pretty active on it, so there's lots of examples of ways you can do this in your training if you're wondering. So there's lots of examples of that, okay? And I'll give you just a simple idea of this principle of progression in action, how it looks, okay? If we looked at week 1, and by the way, this was 3060. This was the total weekly training load from that average week that I showed you. And I'm showing you now a month, 4 weeks, again, also taken directly from my work at the professional level in the USL. This is how we did it. Week 1, the total training load for the week was 3060. We call that our baseline, step 1. Step 2, we increased the load in week 2 by 5%. And we did it by, again, just like I said, these little manipulations of the volume and intensity of training, okay? Week 3, well, we bumped it up by 5% again, up to 3,373. And then in week 4, and this is just, kind of a model that you can follow. In week 4, we actually took it back down again. Okay, and then what I can tell you is then in the 5th week of that little cycle, we actually bumped it up again higher than it was in week 3. Okay, and I don't know if there's any mathematicians here or anybody that's interested in this, but I'll use the term fractal. Does anyone know what fractal means in math? Last chance before I tell you what it means. Okay, so fractal means that if you have something that is very small, that it resembles something that is very large. And then even if you take that new thing that's very large and you make it even larger or magnify the scale, let's say, that you still have something that resembles it. So here's that concept, which I love that concept. And I always, when I'm talking about periodization, I like to explain it. So if you can imagine, we said that a typical week in soccer kind of looks like this, right? That's a typical week, right? With some peaks here, right? That's a peak, and that's a peak, and then some areas where the load dips. So that's a week in soccer, okay? And then from there, if we take that to a month in soccer, which I just showed you, okay, I don't know if it's fair to say, but did we also kind of get that same model there in the month, right? I think we did. We had week 1, week 2, week 3, and then week 4. And then if we went to another month, we would go up to week 5 and so on. So it would kind of look like that again, right? So the month is a fractal of the week. And if you then, again, this is exactly how I teach it in my course, right? If you then look at the entire year as a whole, this is the way you plan it, your entire year should also look like that. It should be wave-like. And maybe what you start to see over time is that it's still wave-like, but that as you progress, the peaks start to get a little bit higher. This is a poor attempt at drawing. Okay, I'll tell you right now, I'm not an artist, okay, but that's basically the idea, is that it's a fractal. The small, the very small, the weekly, intervals look like that. The month, the larger look like that, and even the year look like that as well. And just to show you how useful this is, you could even look at one particular training day. I'm going to go backwards now, and I'm going to say one particular training day within the session. If we looked at the intensity within the session, we might see something like this. I'm going to speak about this in a minute or two, but we would see something like that in the session. There'd be periods where you're working very hard, and then rest periods, wouldn't there? So there you go. Even the training, okay, the week is a fractal of an actual training session. So the very small looks like the very big. And again, this is in university. It actually takes me a week or so to explain that. So I hope I've explained that in whatever it was, 5 minutes now. So so there you go. That's how you plan training. Okay. So we've answered those 2 frequently asked questions. Okay.